In Litali, Tanzania, beneath the volcanic ash that fell 3.5 million years ago, three sets of footprints walk through eternity. Not human footprints, not quite, but something before human, something becoming human. The prints are preserved in stone now, hardened by time and pressure into testimony that will outlast everything humans have built. They walk in a line, these ancient travelers, their steps captured in a moment that geology has made permanent. The ash that preserved them fell from Sadaman volcano on a day when the world was younger and wilder than we can imagine. The ash was wet mixed with rain that had fallen shortly before, creating surface with consistency of fresh concrete. Three individuals walked across this surface, two larger, one smaller, perhaps adult and child, perhaps male and female, perhaps simply companions whose relationship we can never know. They walked barefoot, their feet pressed into the ash, leaving impressions that show heel strike and toe push-off, that show the mechanics of bipedal walking perfected through millions of years of evolution. Australopithecus afarensis. We would name them Lucy's species, after the famous skeleton found in Ethiopia in 1974, after the Beatles' song that played in the excavation camp the night of the discovery. Lucy herself never walked through the ash at Litali. She lived and died 1 million years too early, in different place. But she was the same species as these walkers, was the same kind of creature, stood upright on two legs, had brain not much larger than chimpanzees, lived in the border country between ape and human. The footprints tell us things that bones alone cannot. Tell us that walking upright was not clumsy adaptation, but was perfected. The prints show proper heel strike, proper weight transfer, proper biomechanics of efficient bipedal locomotion. Tell us that these creatures walked together. The prints overlay in ways that suggest they walked at the same time, that they moved as group rather than as isolated individuals passing through at different times. Tell us that they were small. The largest prints are about the size of modern 7-year-olds, suggesting creatures that stood perhaps 4 feet tall. That would have seemed diminutive to modern humans. But why did they walk upright? The question has haunted paleoanthropology since Darwin first proposed that humans evolved from apes. Walking upright is inefficient compared to knuckle walking that chimpanzees use, is slower, requires more energy, makes the body more visible to predators, makes childbirth more difficult because upright posture narrows the birth canal, makes backs vulnerable to injury. The spine that evolved for horizontal four-legged walking is stressed when loaded vertically. Yet upright walking brought advantages that outweighed the costs, freed the hands, made it possible to carry food back to home base rather than eating where food was found, made it possible to carry infants who could no longer cling to mother's fur, made it possible eventually to carry tools and weapons, made it possible to see over tall grass in the savanna, to spot predators and prey from greater distance, made it possible to reduce sun exposure. Upright body presents less surface area to overhead sun than horizontal body, reducing heat stress in tropical environment. The footprints do not tell us which advantage mattered most, do not reveal what was happening in minds of those who walked, do not explain whether they understood themselves as different from the creatures who walked on four legs, whether they sensed they were on threshold between what had been and what would be. The prints are simply evidence of walking, evidence of existence, evidence that 3.5 million years ago, creatures that were not quite human but were no longer quite ape walked across wet ash under African sky. And then more ash fell, covered their tracks gently, like snow covering footprints in fresh powder, buried the impressions beneath layers of sediment that would accumulate across millennia, protected them from erosion and disturbance, preserved them through millions of years of geological change, through epochs when the landscape transformed, through the entire history of human evolution from these early bipeds to modern humans who would eventually uncover the prints and recognize ancestors in impressions left by feet. The discovery came in 1978. Archaeologist Mary Leakey and her team working at Leetali, searching for fossils in layers of volcanic ash. One team member noticed indentations that looked like animal tracks. Careful excavation revealed more tracks: elephants and giraffes and antelopes, and dozens of other species that had walked through the ash. And then the human-like tracks, unmistakable in their form, unquestionable in their meaning. The excavation became pilgrimage site for paleoanthropologists. The prints were studied from every angle, measured precisely, photographed exhaustively, cast in plaster for preservation and research. The prints remain in Tanzania, now protected by layers of sand and soil placed over them after excavation, preserved for future generations, waiting beneath the earth like secret that can be visited but never fully possessed. Some plaster casts are displayed in museums in Tanzania's National Museum in Dar es Salaam, in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, in universities and research institutions around the world. The casts allow millions to see what only a handful of archaeologists saw in person. But the casts are not the same as the original, lack the weight of authenticity, lack the connection to the actual moment, lack the profound strangeness of standing where ancestors stood millions of years ago. The footprints ask questions that we cannot answer but cannot stop asking. What were they thinking as they walked? Were they aware of themselves as individuals, as distinct from the group? Did they have language, even rudimentary language? Or did they communicate through gestures and vocalizations that left no trace? Did they have culture, traditions that were passed from generation to generation? Or did each generation learn anew how to survive in the world? Did they have beliefs about death, about the cosmos, about meaning? We will never know. The prints preserve only the physical, the size and shape of feet, the pattern of walking, the evidence that they existed and moved through space. Everything else is speculation, informed speculation based on comparison with modern primates and modern humans, but speculation nonetheless. The minds that moved these feet are gone. The voices that may have called to each other are silent. The world they inhabited has transformed beyond recognition, yet the prints speak across the silence, speak in the language of presence. I was here. I walked. I existed. Speak in the language of connection. I am your ancestor. You are my descendant. The line that connects us is unbroken across 3.5 million years. Speak in the language of mystery. I am like you, but not like you. I am human, but not human. I am threshold between what was and what you became. The footprints walk through time. Walk from that moment when ash was wet and feet pressed down, through all the millennia when prints lay buried and unknown, through the moment of discovery when modern humans recognized ancient relatives, forward into future when other humans will stand where we stand now and wonder at the persistence of these traces. The prints are evidence, are testimony, are the beginning of the story of how ape became human, of how walking upright led to all that followed, of how a single step repeated became migration that would carry humanity across the entire earth. The footprints walk still frozen in stone, walking through eternity, carrying the question of who we were and who we are and who we will become. 3 travelers, 3.5 million years ago, walking together into time that had no end, leaving prints that would outlast everything, marking the threshold where the journey toward humanity began. The prints remain. The walkers are gone. But the journey continues in every step we take, in every recognition that we are the inheritors of that first walking, that we carry forward what they began. The footprints that walked through time, forever preserved, forever walking, forever the beginning. Deep in the earth, in chambers that daylight never reaches, The first artists descended with fire and ochre, and intention that we can only dimly reconstruct. The caves were not homes, were too deep, too dark, too dangerous for habitation, were sanctuaries, were thresholds between worlds, were places where humans went not to live but to transform, to make visible something invisible, to capture on stone walls the animals that haunted their days and dreams. Chauvet Cave in southern France, discovered in 1994 by three speleologists who squeezed through narrow entrance and found themselves in galleries that had been sealed for 30,000 years. The first chamber took their breath away. Hundreds of animals painted on the walls in charcoal and ochre, horses and rhinoceroses and lions and mammoths and bison. The paintings were not crude, were masterworks, were sophisticated art that used shading and perspective and the cave's natural contours to create three-dimensional effects, to make animals seem to move in flickering torchlight. The horses gallop across the stone. Their heads are turned, their manets are flying, their bodies twist with motion that seems impossible to capture in static medium. The bison are massive, their heads lowered, their shoulders hunched with power, their forms so precisely rendered that species can be identified from anatomical details. The lions prowl, dozens of them in a pride, their faces showing individual expressions, their bodies arranged in compositional groups that suggest narrative, that tell story we cannot fully read. The artists understood what they were doing, understood perspective. The animals that are meant to be farther away are drawn smaller, are placed higher on the wall. Understood shading. The charcoal is applied in gradations that create volume, that make flat surface appear rounded. Understood the cave itself used natural bulges in the stone to create animal bodies, used cracks and shadows to define edges, used the three-dimensional reality of the wall to enhance the three-dimensional illusion of the paintings. But who were these artists? We know almost nothing about them. They left no bones in Chauvet. The cave was never inhabited, was visited only for painting, and for whatever ceremonies or rituals the painting served. They left footprints, one child's footprint preserved in soft clay, one torch mark on the wall showing where someone steadied themselves while painting. They left the charcoal from their torch's carbon that can be dated. That tells us the cave was visited multiple times over thousands of years, that generations returned to paint alongside ancestors' work. We do not know why they painted in darkness. The paintings are located deep in the cave, sometimes hundreds of meters from the entrance, sometimes in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages to reach. always in places where natural light could never penetrate. The artists worked by torchlight pine torches that burned for perhaps 20 minutes before needing to be replaced, that created light that flickered and moved, and made the painted animals seem to breathe and shift. The experience of seeing these paintings by torchlight must have been transformative, must have felt like the animals were alive, were present, were spirits called forth from stone. Some scholars say hunting magic, say that painting the animal gave power over the animal, that depicting successful hunt made successful hunt more likely in reality. Point to the choice of dangerous animals, lions and rhinoceroses and mammoths, that would have been difficult and dangerous to hunt. Point to the careful attention to anatomy that suggests intimate knowledge born of hunting. Point to similar practices in recent hunting cultures where painting or sculpture of prey animal is believed to affect the hunt. Some say shamanic vision. Say that caves were doorways to spirit world, that darkness and isolation and sensory deprivation created conditions for altered states of consciousness. Say that the paintings record visions experienced during trance states. The animals are spirit guides, are messengers from other world, are manifestations of the sacred that could only be accessed through caves' darkness, and through rituals we can no longer reconstruct. Point to the mysterious symbols that accompany the animal's dots and lines and geometric shapes that might represent altered perception, that might be maps of spirit journeys, that might mean things we cannot decode. Some say simply beauty. Say that even 30,000 years ago, humans created art because art was essential, because making beauty mattered as much as making tools. Say that the impulse to transform stone into story is fundamental to human consciousness, that the caves were galleries, and the artists were artists in the full modern sense, creating not for practical benefit but for aesthetic satisfaction, for the joy of making, for the need to express something that could not be expressed in any other way. We will never know with certainty. The artists left no written explanation, left no unambiguous evidence of purpose, left only the paintings themselves and the testimony of the caves, the long journeys into darkness, the careful choice of surfaces, the repeated visits across millennia, left evidence of sophistication that shatters stereotypes about primitive humans. These were not crude drawings by simple minds, were masterworks by artists who understood their craft as well as any Renaissance painter would understand theirs. Altamira in Spain, discovered in 1879 by an archaeologist and his young daughter who looked up at the ceiling and saw bison painted so vividly they seemed ready to stampede down from the stone. The discovery was met with skepticism. Many scholars refused to believe that prehistoric humans could create such sophisticated art, accused the discoverer of fraud. The paintings were too good, too accomplished, too modern in their techniques to be 30,000 years old. Only decades later, after more caves were discovered, after the evidence became overwhelming, was Altamira accepted as authentic. Lascaux in France, discovered by teenagers in 1940 who were exploring after their dog fell into a hole that led to cave entrance. The Hall of the Bulls contains the largest prehistoric paintings ever found, animals more than 17 feet long, painted on ceiling in compositions that seem choreographed. The paintings were so spectacular that Lascaux became tourist destination thousands visited yearly, until the moisture from their breath began damaging the paintings. The cave was closed to public in 1963. Remains closed. Will remain closed forever probably. Can be visited only through replicas, full-scale reconstructions built nearby, where tourists can experience approximation of what the original looks like. The closing of Lascaux teaches hard lesson. Teaches that preservation and access are intention, that the paintings survived 30,000 years sealed in darkness, but cannot survive 20 years of public viewing, that our desire to see must be balanced against need to preserve, that sometimes the only way to protect the past is to keep it hidden, to let it exist in darkness where it has always existed, to accept that some sacred things cannot be made public without being destroyed in the process. Indonesia's caves contain paintings as old as Europe's discovered more recently, but equally sophisticated, proving that the impulse to paint in caves was not limited to one region, was not unique to European humans but was widespread, was perhaps universal human behavior 30,000 years ago. The Indonesian paintings show stencils, hundreds of hands pressed against walls with pigment blown around them through tubes. Show animals, the prehistoric pigs and deer that lived in Southeast Asian rainforests. Show that humans on opposite sides of the earth, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, were creating similar art at similar times. The similarity raises questions. Was cave painting invented once and spread through cultural transmission? Or did it arise independently in different places because all humans share cognitive structures that make this kind of expression natural? Did the first cave painters in France know about cave painters in Indonesia or vice versa? Or did they discover the same techniques, the same impulse, the same recognition that stone could hold images, that darkness could become canvas, that shadows could be transformed into spirit. The caves hold their secrets, hold the breath of artists who crawled through narrow passages to reach hidden chambers, hold the soot from torches that burned while paint was applied, hold the silence that has accumulated across millennia, silence broken only occasionally by discoverers and researchers, and the rare visitors who are granted access. Hold the darkness that is not absence but presence, thick darkness that presses close, that makes light precious, that creates conditions where normal perception is altered. When we stand in these caves, in the few that are open, in the many that are closed to preserve what remains, we stand in presence of first known human consciousness that recognized itself as conscious. Stand in presence of minds that knew they could transform stone into story, that knew art was possible, that knew the invisible could be made visible. Stand in presence of the sacred, whatever sacred meant to them, however they understood the relationship between human and animal and spirit and stone. The paintings remain protected now by regulations and restrictions, and the recognition that they are too precious to risk, too important to let them fade, remain as testimony to human creativity that is 30,000 years old but is not primitive. Remain as evidence that art is not luxury but necessity, that making beauty matters, that humans have always needed to transform the world through imagination and skill, and the application of pigment to surface. The cave where shadows became spirit. The darkness that was made luminous. The stone that was transformed into story. Forever painted, forever preserved. Forever testimony that humans 30,000 years ago were not so different from us, had the same needs, the same drives, the same capacity to see beyond immediate survival and to create beauty that would outlast the maker. The caves wait in darkness. The paintings endure. And the spirits of the animals still seem to move when light flickers across stone, still gallop and prowl and breathe, still carry mystery of why they were painted, still witness to consciousness that recognized itself and left these marks so we would know that they existed, that they saw, that they created, that they were human. In a cave in Slovenia, 40,000 years ago, someone carved a flute from the femur of a cave bear. Not roughly carved, precisely crafted with holes drilled at calculated intervals, with mouthpiece shaped to direct air, with attention to detail that speaks of knowledge, of skill, of understanding that sound could be shaped and controlled and made beautiful. The flute is silent now, too fragile to play, too precious to risk damaging. But in that silence lives the echo of all the music that has been lost, all the melodies that moved through ancient camps and never left trace except this single bone pierced with holes. The cave bear femur was good choice for flute making. Was hollow naturally, the marrow cavity providing ready-made sound chamber. Was strong bare bone is dense and durable, could withstand the stress of being carved and played. Was available cave bears were large and numerous in Ice Age Europe, were hunted for food and fur, left bones that could be repurposed. The maker selected a femur of appropriate size long enough to create range of notes, straight enough to drill cleanly, smooth enough to work precisely. The holes were drilled with stone tools, probably flint points rotated by hand or with bow drill, cutting through bone grain by grain until the hole penetrated. The drilling required patience. Bone is hard. Stone tools are slow. Making single hole might take hours. The maker drilled at least 4 holes. The flute is fragmentary, broken at both ends, but the surviving section shows 2 complete holes and evidence of at least 2 more. The spacing of the holes was not random, was calculated to produce specific intervals, to create scale that would sound musical rather than merely noisy. We cannot reconstruct the music that was played on this flute or on others like it that have been found across Europe. Cannot know whether the melodies were simple or complex, whether they were improvised or were traditional tunes passed down through generations, whether they were played for ceremony or entertainment, or simply for the joy of making sound. But we know the music existed. Know that 40,000 years ago, humans were creating melodies, were arranging notes intentionally, were making music that served no immediate survival function, but that fed something else, something that needed feeding as much as bodies needed food. Music is older than the oldest flute. Simple percussion probably came first. Rhythm created by clapping hands or striking stones together or beating on hollow logs. Rhythm is fundamental, appears in all human cultures, appears even in infants who respond to musical beats before they can speak, appears to be wired into neural structures that evolved for reasons we don't fully understand. But melody is different, requires pitch perception, requires memory of note sequences, requires understanding that sounds can be arranged into patterns that create emotional responses. The flute represents cognitive sophistication, represents understanding of acoustics, that shorter tubes produce higher pitches, that holes placed at specific positions allow different notes, that breath pressure affects tone and volume. Represents planning. The work of making flute took hours or days. The maker had to envision the finished instrument before beginning, had to know what they were trying to create. represents culture flute-making knowledge had to be transmitted. Someone had to teach the maker, or the maker had to learn through observation and experimentation. The skill accumulated across generations. Music serves many functions in human societies. Serves as entertainment pleasure for its own sake, beauty that exists because humans value beauty. Serves as communication, songs carry information, teach lessons, preserve histories in cultures without writing. Serves as bonding group, singing creates synchrony, creates emotional resonance, strengthens social ties. Serves as ceremony, marks important occasions, accompanies rituals, connects participants to sacred. Serves as expression, allows articulation of emotions that words cannot capture, provides outlet for feelings that have no other form. Which function did the flute serve 40,000 years ago? Probably all of them. Probably music was already deeply woven into human life, already serving multiple purposes simultaneously. The flute might have been played around evening fires, entertainment during long winter nights when darkness came early, and there was little to do but gather for warmth and companionship. Might have accompanied ceremonies, births and deaths, and coming-of-age rituals that marked life's transitions. Might have been used for courtship, demonstrating skill, creating beauty, attracting mates through musical ability as songbirds attract through song. Other flutes have been found in Germany and in France and scattered across sites where humans lived during Ice Age. Most are made from bird bones, hollow wing bones of swans or vultures that are naturally suited for flute making, that require less work to transform into instruments. Some are made from ivory mammoth tusk, carved and shaped, representing enormous investment of time and material in creating something that produces nothing but sound. The variety of materials suggests that flute making was widespread practice, was not isolated invention, but was common knowledge shared across populations. The earliest flutes coincide with other evidence of symbolic behavior, cave paintings and carved figurines and elaborate burials that appear in archaeological record around the same time. The coincidence suggests cognitive revolution, some change in human brain, or in human culture that made abstract thinking possible, that enabled art and music and complex ritual. The change might have been biological, some genetic mutation that altered neural wiring. Might have been cultural, some innovation in language or social organization that unlocked capabilities that had always been latent. Might have been both biological and cultural changes, reinforcing each other in feedback loop that accelerated development. Neanderthals made flutes too, or at least some archaeologists believe they did. A bone flute found in Slovenia in cave occupied by Neanderthals has holes that some researchers argue are deliberately made, are too evenly spaced to be tooth marks or natural damage. Other researchers disagree, argue the holes are indeed tooth marks, that Neanderthals did not have symbolic culture, that flute-making was unique to modern humans. The debate reflects broader questions about Neanderthal cognition, about whether they were as sophisticated as modern humans or were fundamentally different. But even if Neanderthals did not make flutes, they almost certainly had music, had rhythm at minimum, clapping and drumming that requires no tools, that appears in all human cultures, that probably predates humans entirely. Might have had singing. Neanderthal vocal anatomy could produce speech and singing. Their hyoid bones are similar to ours. Their control of breath and larynx was sophisticated. Whether they sang melodies or only made rhythmic vocalizations, we cannot know. Singing leaves no trace except in bones that shaped sound, in cultural practices that might be inferred from other evidence, in the universal human capacity for music that Neanderthals probably shared. The bone flute asks what music means. Why do humans make it? Why does it matter? Evolutionary psychologists debate whether music is adaptation was selected for because it provided survival or reproductive advantages, or is byproduct of other cognitive capacities that were selected for other reasons. The debate may be false choice. Music probably became adaptation because it provided so many benefits simultaneously. Strengthened groups through synchronized activity, enhanced language learning through rhythmic and melodic patterns, improved parent-infant bonding through lullabies, marked group identity through shared songs. The benefits accumulated until music became fundamental to human nature, until humans without music would have been at disadvantage. The silence of the flute is eloquent, reminds us that sound is ephemeral, disappears instantly, leaves no physical trace, exists only in moment of creation. Reminds us that most of human culture is lost because most of human culture was sound and gesture and knowledge transmitted orally. Reminds us that the bone flute represents not one person's music, but represents the existence of musical tradition, represents entire worlds of sound that played through 40,000 years and left no record except this one carved bone. Imagine the first flute being played. Someone by firelight, fingers moving over holes, breath flowing through hollow bone, notes emerging into night air. Others listening, children and adults and elders, gathered close for warmth, attending to melody that rises and falls. The music might be haunting minor key perhaps, echoing the loneliness of Ice Age nights, might be joyful celebrating successful hunt or the return of spring, might be mournful commemorating loss, expressing grief through sound. Whatever the melody, the listeners understood, responded emotionally, connected through shared experience of beauty made audible, the bone that held the first music, the flute that proves melody existed 40,000 years ago, the instrument that remains silent but that speaks of all the music that humans have made, of all the songs that have carried meaning and emotion and culture across generations, forever carved, forever silent, forever testimony that humans make beauty not just for survival but for its own sake, that music matters, that even 40,000 years ago our ancestors understood that life requires more than food and shelter, requires beauty, requires sound shaped into melody, requires the breath that becomes song. The bone flute, forever preserved, forever testimony, forever the first music we can prove existed, the beginning of all the songs that followed. In Sungir, Russia, 30,000 years ago, two children were buried together. Not simply buried, were laid head to head in a grave that had been prepared with care, were adorned with thousands of ivory beads that someone had spent months carving, were surrounded by spears and artwork, and all the materials that the living believed the dead would need. The burial was not disposal but ceremony, was recognition that death mattered, was acknowledgement that the relationship between living and dead was not severed, but was transformed. The grave was discovered in 1960s Soviet archaeologists excavating Paleolithic site, finding burial that shocked them with its elaboration. The two children lay head to head, their feet pointing in opposite directions, creating symmetry that was clearly intentional. They wore clothing or shrouds that had been decorated with ivory beads, thousands of beads sewn onto fabric that has long since decayed, leaving only the beads in patterns that suggest the original garment's design. The boys' clothing bore approximately 4,900 beads. The girls bore approximately 5,275. Each bead had been carved from mammoth ivory, had been perforated with a hole for sewing, represented hours of skilled labor. The mathematics are staggering. Each bead required perhaps an hour to make, shaping the ivory, drilling the hole, smoothing the surface. 10,000 beads therefore represent 10,000 hours of work, more than a year of full-time labor if one person had made them all. More likely the work was distributed, multiple people carving beads, contributing to the burial preparations, participating in process that was communal rather than individual. The investment of time and material speaks of how important the burial was, how much the community valued these children or their family, how deeply the living cared about honoring the dead. Why were they buried together? Were they siblings? The skeletal analysis shows they were similar age, perhaps 10 to 12 years old, but does not prove kinship. Were they twins? Possible but unprovable. Did they die at the same time from the same cause, disease, or accident? Or did they die separately and were buried together because of some relationship or belief system that required shared grave? The grave offers no answers, only the fact of togetherness, the deliberate positioning, the shared elaborate grave goods. The grave contained other objects beyond the beads. Spears made from mammoth ivory, straightened and sharpened and polished, functional weapons or symbolic objects or both. Carved figurines, small sculptures whose meaning we can only guess. A human femur filled with ochre red pigment that was used across Paleolithic world for body painting and burial rituals, that might have symbolized blood or life or rebirth. The objects were not random, were chosen deliberately, were placed with intention, were part of ceremonial practice that had meaning within the culture that performed it. This was not the first human burial. Neanderthals buried their dead earlier, graves dating to 60,000 years ago show bodies deliberately placed in pits, sometimes with apparent grave goods, always with care that suggests respect or affection or belief in afterlife. The Neanderthal burials are simpler than Sungir, no elaborate beadwork, no extensive grave goods, but show the same fundamental recognition that death requires marking, that the dead deserve more than abandonment, that burial is cultural practice that separates humans from animals. But Sungir shows elaboration beyond necessity, shows that 30,000 years ago, humans had moved beyond simple burial to complex ceremony. The beads required not just skill, but planning. Someone had to decide that the burial required thousands of beads, had to organize the carving, had to coordinate the creation of garments, had to manage the logistics of acquiring ivory and drilling holes and sewing beads to fabric. The organization implies social complexity, implies leaders or specialists, implies division of labor, implies cultural traditions about how burials should be conducted. Why elaborate burials? Multiple explanations are offered, all probably partially true. Status: elaborate burial demonstrated families' wealth and importance, displayed resources that could be invested in non-productive purposes, created lasting monument to family's position. Grief love demanded expression through effort. Making beautiful things for the dead was way of processing loss. The labor was itself the mourning. Spiritual belief. The dead needed provisions for journey to otherworld. Careful preparation ensured safe passage. The grave goods were practical necessities for afterlife travel. Or perhaps the burial was about memory. Perhaps the elaborate ceremony created memory that would persist, the community gathering for burial, participating in ritual, witnessing the display of beads and spears and grave goods. The memory would be transmitted. Children who attended would remember, would tell their children. The story of the burial would become part of community's oral tradition. The memory would bind community, shared experience of ritual, shared investment in ceremony, shared beliefs about death and afterlife. The burial was not just about the dead, was equally about the living, about creating cohesion, about affirming shared values and beliefs. The grave was not unique. Other burials from Sungir show similar elaboration, an adult male buried with similar ivory beads, with decorated cap, with ivory pins and bracelets. The burials together suggest that elaborate grave goods were not reserved for special individuals but were common practice, were standard way of treating the dead, were cultural norm rather than exception. The normativity implies that beliefs about death and afterlife were widespread, were not individual quirks, but were shared by entire community or perhaps by entire regional culture. Other elaborate Paleolithic burials have been found across Europe and beyond. The Red Lady of Paviland in Wales, actually, a young man despite the name, buried 26,000 years ago, covered in red ochre, buried with ivory rods and shells, and all the materials for elaborate ceremony. The burials at Dolní Věstonice in Czech Republic, multiple individuals buried with grave goods, with evidence of ceremonial fire, with careful positioning that suggests ritual significance. The elaboration appears wherever archaeologists find Paleolithic burials, appears to be universal human practice, appears to be fundamental to how humans understand death. What did they believe about afterlife? We can only speculate. Perhaps they believed the dead traveled to another world, a spirit world that existed alongside physical world, that required provisioning, that the living could effect through proper burial. Perhaps they believed in reincarnation, the dead would return in new bodies. The grave goods would somehow transfer with them, or would honor them in preparation for return. Perhaps they believed the dead remained present, became ancestors who watched over the living, who required honor and gifts, who could bless or curse depending on how they were treated. Or perhaps they believed nothing specific about afterlife, but buried elaborately because doing so felt right, felt necessary, felt like the appropriate response to loss. Perhaps the burial was not about beliefs, but about emotions, the grief that demanded expression, the love that required demonstration, the sense that death was too significant to leave unmarked. Perhaps the elaborate burial was humans' first attempt to impose meaning on mortality, to assert that death was not simply biological cessation, but was transition that had cultural and perhaps cosmic significance. The grave at Sungir is preserved now, the skeletons in museum storage, the beads catalogued and photographed, the site protected for future research. But the meaning is not preserved, cannot be extracted from bones and beads and careful documentation. The meaning died with the people who created it, with the culture that believed whatever they believed, with the last person who knew what the burial meant and did not transmit that knowledge before dying. Yet something persists. Something in the care taken, in the hours invested, in the deliberate positioning and elaborate decoration speaks across 30,000 years, speaks of recognition that death matters, speaks of belief that the dead deserve honor, speaks of refusal to accept that death ends everything. The body may die, but something persists, if only in memory, if only in the minds of those who remain, if only in the elaborate burial that says, "You mattered, you were loved, you will be remembered." The grave that remembered the dead, the burial that required months of preparation, the ceremony that honored children who died too young, forever preserved, forever testimony, forever evidence that 30,000 years ago humans understood that being human meant caring for the dead, meant marking death with ritual, meant recognizing that mortality was not just biological fact but was cultural and spiritual crisis that required response. The grave remains. The children are gone. But the memory persists in every burial that follows, in every ritual that honors death, in every recognition that the dead deserve more than forgetting. The grave, forever remembering, forever testimony that humans have always understood that death is not the end of relationship, that the dead remain present in memory and in ceremony, and in the elaborate graves that say, "You were here, you existed, you mattered." Somewhere between 70 and 50,000 years ago, in the tidelands where the Red Sea meets the African coast, a small group of humans stood at the edge of the known world and looked across water toward distant shore barely visible through heat, shimmer, and morning mist. Behind them was Africa, the only continent that humans and their ancestors had ever inhabited, the cradle of humanity, where every human species had evolved and lived and died for millions of years. Ahead was unknown territory that no human had ever seen, lands whose dangers and possibilities were beyond imagination, the vast expanse of Asia, and eventually Europe and far beyond. They crossed. We know they crossed because we are here, because every human alive today whose ancestors left Africa carries genetic markers that trace back to this exodus, to this moment when small population walked or sailed across narrow strait that separated continents. The crossing was not dramatic, not conscious decision to explore, not organized expedition, not heroic quest. Was probably drift groups following coastline, moving gradually eastward along shores, crossing the Red Sea without necessarily knowing they were leaving Africa, finding themselves in Asia through accumulation of small movements rather than through single deliberate journey. But however it happened, whether sudden or gradual, whether intentional or accidental, the crossing changed everything. Changed humanity from African species into global species. Initiated migration that would eventually carry humans to every habitable corner of Earth, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from tiny Pacific islands to windswept Patagonian plains. Began the diaspora that would create all the diversity of human cultures and languages and physical forms that exists today. Why did they leave? The question haunts migration studies. Africa was familiar, was home. Contained everything humans needed: game animals and edible plants, and water sources and territories their ancestors had inhabited for millions of years. Leaving meant abandoning familiarity for uncertainty, trading known dangers for unknown possibilities, risking that new territories might not support human life, or might contain threats that African experience had not prepared them for. Population pressure is common explanation. The idea is that Africa was filling up, that human populations had grown, until competition for resources became intense, that groups on the margins were pushed into less desirable territories, that the pressure accumulated until some groups found themselves at Africa's edges with nowhere to go but outward. The explanation is plausible but unprovable. We cannot reconstruct Ice Age population densities with enough precision to know whether pressure was real, or whether leaving was choice made for other reasons. Climate change is another explanation. Around 70,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano erupted in Indonesia, ejecting enormous quantities of ash into atmosphere, potentially triggering volcanic winter that lasted years. The climate stress might have made parts of Africa less habitable, might have lowered sea levels enough to expose land bridges or narrow straits, might have created conditions where migration became more attractive or more necessary. But the timing is uncertain. The Exodus might have preceded Toba, or might have followed it by thousands of years. The connection is speculative. Curiosity is often dismissed but should not be. Humans are curious, want to see what lies beyond horizon, want to explore, want to know what exists in territories not yet visited. The drive might seem impractical when survival is difficult, but curiosity is deeply human, is part of what makes us human, might have been selected for because groups that explored found new resources and opportunities that stay-at-home groups never discovered. Perhaps some groups left Africa simply because they wondered what lay beyond, because the distant shore beckoned, because the urge to see what was there overcame the caution that said staying was safer. The genetics tell us that the exodus involved small population, perhaps a few hundred people, perhaps fewer. The number is derived from genetic diversity. All non-African humans are remarkably similar genetically, much more similar than African populations, suggesting that all non-Africans descended from small founding population that left Africa and then expanded. The small number means the exodus was not mass migration, but was minor movement, was peripheral population that left while vast majority of humans remained in Africa. But that small population was enough, was seed that would grow into billions. The migrants followed coasts, moved eastward along Indian Ocean shores, living on beach resources, eating shellfish and fish, and whatever terrestrial animals they could hunt. The coastal migration was relatively easy, food was abundant, climate was warm, the route was linear without requiring navigation through hostile interiors. The archaeological evidence is mostly underwater. Now sea levels were lower during Ice Age. The coasts where migrants lived are now beneath ocean. The campsites and tools are inaccessible, except where rare geological circumstances have preserved them. The migrants reached India, reached Southeast Asia, reached Australia by 50,000 years ago, required boat building and navigation to cross open water between Southeast Asian mainland and Australian continent, reached Northern Asia, reached Europe by 40,000 years ago, required adaptation to colder climates, required development of cold weather clothing and housing and survival strategies, reached Siberia, and eventually crossed into Americas, by 15,000 years ago or earlier, required surviving in some of Earth's harshest environments, required technologies sophisticated enough to support human life in Arctic conditions. Each new territory required adaptation, required learning which plants were edible and which were poison, required developing hunting strategies appropriate to local animals, required discovering how to find water, how to make shelter, how to survive the particular challenges that each environment presented. The adaptations were mostly cultural. Humans are relatively non-specialized biologically, lack fur or thick hide or other physical adaptations that would limit us to specific environments. Our adaptation is behavioral. We learn how to survive. We create technologies. We build shelters and make clothing and control fire, and thereby live in territories where our naked bodies could not survive. The migration created diversity. Populations that separated developed different cultures, different languages, different technologies, experienced different evolutionary pressures. High-altitude populations developed physiological adaptations to low oxygen. Northern populations developed lighter skin that could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently in low-light conditions. Various populations developed resistance to local diseases. The diversity accumulated over thousands of years of separation, created the variety of human forms and cultures that exists today. But the separation was never complete. Populations remained in contact through trade and intermarriage and migration. Ideas and technologies and genes flowed between groups continuously. The human family tree is not tree, but network branching and rejoining constantly, creating relationships too complex to be captured in simple diagrams, demonstrating that humans have always been one species despite geographic separation and cultural diversity. The migration continues. Humans are still moving, still migrating from continent to continent, from country to country, still following opportunities, still fleeing dangers, still carrying forward the restlessness that made the first exodus possible. We are migrants still, are the children of those who walked out of Africa, are inheritors of curiosity and courage and adaptability that made global humanity possible. The migration that walked out of Africa, the exodus that began human diaspora, the journey that transformed African species into global species, forever walking, forever migrating, forever restless, forever the small group that crossed narrow strait and never looked back, that walked eastward along coasts until they had circled the world, that adapted and survived and multiplied until their descendants covered the earth. The journey continues. The migration persists. And we are all every human alive today, except those whose ancestors never left Africa. We are all the children of Exodus, the descendants of migrants, the inheritors of journey that began 50,000 years ago and continues still. In caves across the world scattered through continents that would not be named for thousands of years, hidden in limestone chambers that daylight never reaches, preserved in conditions that only accident and geology could create, hands appear on walls. Not painted hands depicting human form, not representations or symbols or abstractions, but negative images, silhouettes. The actual hands of actual people pressed against actual stone, while pigment was blown around them through hollow bones or reeds, creating outlines that would persist for 40,000 years. The technique was simple. Place hand flat against cave wall. Mix pigment ochre or charcoal or manganese with water or animal fat to create paint. Fill mouth or hollow tube with the mixture. Blow the pigment around the hand, creating mist that settles on stone but not on hand. Remove hand. The result is hand-shaped void surrounded by color-negative image where absence creates presence, where what is not painted defines what is seen. The hands speak across millennia in gesture older than language, more universal than words. They say, "I was here." Say, "I existed." Say, "I am human like you are human. Look, my hand matches yours. My fingers spread the same way. The span of my palm is the same as your palm." They say, "Remember me," in the most direct way possible, not through symbol that requires interpretation, not through representation that might be misunderstood, but through actual mark left by actual flesh pressed against actual stone. The hands appear in Chauvet Cave in France alongside the magnificent animal paintings, on walls and ceilings, creating gallery of human presence that accompanies the bestiary. Appear in El Castillo Cave in Spain dated to 40,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known art in Europe. Appear in caves in Indonesia, proving the practice was not European invention, but was widespread, was perhaps universal human behavior. Appear in Argentina, proving the practice reached the Americas, proving that humans separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years were making the same gesture, pressing hands to stone and saying, "I was here." Some hands are whole 5 fingers spread, thumb extended, palm flat against stone. Some are missing fingers, whether from injury or from ritual amputation or from deliberate gesture. We cannot know. Some researchers suggest the missing fingers are not missing, but are bent held against palm deliberately to create different shapes, to communicate meanings through hand signs that have no written record. Other researchers argue the fingers are truly missing, that some cave painters had lost digits to frostbite or hunting accidents, or to intentional removal performed for ritual purposes unknown to us. Some hands are large adult hands, probably male based on size and proportion. Some are small children's hands, women's hands, creating record of who was present in caves, who participated in whatever ceremonies or practices the hand marking served. Some appear alone, single hand on isolated wall, solitary gesture of presence. Some appear in clusters, dozens of hands overlapping, creating palimpsests where one generation marked stone and later generation marked again, where individual hands become collective presence. The hands were made by individuals, but they speak collectively. Speak of community, the people who descended into caves together, who participated in ritual that involved multiple people, who witnessed each other's marking and added their own marks to the collection. Speak of continuity, the caves were visited repeatedly across centuries or millennia. The hand marking was tradition passed from generation to generation, each new visitor adding to the accumulation. Speak of connection between the markers and us, between past and present, between the moment when hand pressed stone and the moment when we press our own hand against the same surface and feel the alignment. When visitors to these caves place their own hands against the ancient silhouettes where it is permitted, where modern conservation allows careful touching, sometimes the hands match. The span is identical. The fingers align perfectly. The thumb reaches to the same point. In those moments, 40,000 years collapse. Time folds. The cave painter becomes present not as abstract ancestor, but as individual whose hand was as real as ours, whose fingers were the same length, whose gesture of marking stone is identical to our gesture of remembering them. The matching is profound, is recognition that transcends intellect, that operates at level of body and instinct, and the immediate understanding that comes when two hands align across time. The cave painter was not primitive human whose consciousness was different from ours. Was person exactly like us, had the same hand, the same span, the same 5 fingers and opposable thumb that define human manipulation, had the same need to mark presence, to say, I existed, to leave trace that would outlast the body. But why hands? Why this particular image among all the images that could have been created? The hands are not art in the sense that animal paintings are art, are not representations of something else, are not depicting hands but are presenting hands, are the hands themselves, are the most direct possible record of individual human presence. The hands are not symbols requiring interpretation, are not metaphors or abstractions, are actual traces left by actual bodies in actual moment of marking. Perhaps the hands were signatures, were the Paleolithic equivalent of writing one's name, the individual claiming authorship, saying, "I made this," or "I witnessed this," or simply, "I was here when this happened." Perhaps the hands were part of initiation ceremonies, adolescents descending into caves as part of coming-of-age ritual, marking their transition to adulthood by pressing hand to stone and being witnessed by community. Perhaps the hands were prayer raised in gesture of supplication or blessing, captured on stone as permanent offering to whatever powers the caves represented. Or perhaps the hands were simply presence, were assertion of existence without requiring justification or explanation. Were humans saying, "We are here because being here mattered, because existence deserved marking, because the cave walls could hold memory, and the hands could create that memory through simplest possible gesture, the pressing of palm against stone, the blowing of pigment, the removal that leaves outline behind." The hands are vulnerable in ways that animal paintings are not. The pigment is delicate, can be damaged by touch, by moisture, by the carbon dioxide that modern visitors exhale. Many caves with hand prints have been closed to public, can be visited only through photographs and replicas, can be experienced only at remove that prevents the direct contact that makes the hand so powerful. The closing is necessary, preservation requires it. The hands cannot survive thousands of modern touches after surviving 40,000 years in darkness. But the closing is also loss, prevents the alignment of ancient hand with modern hand, prevents the direct connection that makes time collapse. Some caves have built replicas, full-scale reproductions, where visitors can place hands against simulated stone and see how they align with ancient silhouettes. The replicas serve important function, allow access without damage, allow experience without endangering originals. But replicas are not the same, lack the authenticity, lack the actual stone that actual hands touched, lack the direct connection to moment of creation. The replica is representation of hands that were themselves not representations, but were actual presence. The hands ask to be remembered, ask to be recognized, ask us to acknowledge that they lived and breathed and wondered and left these marks so we would know they existed. The hands reach through time, reach toward us across 40,000 years, Reach from moment when humans were anatomically modern but culturally young. Reach with gesture that says, I am human like you are human. My hand is like your hand, recognize me. The hands are everywhere in every culture that left cave art, in every region where humans lived during Paleolithic, in locations separated by oceans and millennia, but connected by shared human impulse to mark presence on permanent surface. The universality suggests something fundamental, that marking presence is not cultural practice that some groups developed and others didn't, but is human practice, is something all humans do because being human means needing to say, I am here, I exist, remember me. The hand that marked the stone, the gesture that outlasted empires, the presence that persists through absence, forever pressed against stone, forever reaching toward us, forever asking to be recognized, to be remembered, to be acknowledged as human presence that mattered then and matters still. The hands remain negative images where absence creates presence, where the void left by removed hand speaks louder than any positive image could speak, where the actual trace of actual flesh says, I was here, in language that requires no translation. The hands, forever reaching, forever present, forever testimony that humans 40,000 years ago were exactly like us, had the same hands, the same need to mark existence, the same understanding that stone could hold memory longer than flesh. The hands reach still, reach toward us, reach across time that means nothing when two hands align and 40,000 years disappear in recognition that the hand that pressed stone then is like the hand that touches stone now. The hands, forever marking, forever present, forever human. Around fire, always around fire, the first stories were born. Not written stories that could be preserved on clay or parchment. Not recorded stories that could be replayed through technology humans would not invent for millennia, but spoken words that carried memory and meaning through sound alone, through voice and gesture, and the shared attention of listeners gathered in darkness that pressed close beyond the circle of light. The fire created the conditions for storytelling, created the gathering place where group could sit after day's work was finished, after game had been hunted and processed, after tools had been repaired and shelters had been secured, created the boundary warm center surrounded by cold darkness, safe space surrounded by danger, illuminated faces surrounded by night where predators prowled, and where venturing alone meant death. Created the duration hours between sunset and sleep, when there was nothing to do but talk and listen, when productivity gave way to community, when survival's immediate demands receded enough to allow something else. The fire created the mood, the flickering light that made shadows dance, the play of illumination across familiar faces that made them strange, that transformed them into masks, that made the boundary between real and imagined permeable. The warmth that allowed relaxation, that made possible the drowsiness that opens consciousness to narrative, that creates receptive state where stories can enter deeply. The sound of crackling wood that provided rhythm, that filled silences, that made the gathering musical even before anyone spoke. What were the first stories? We can only guess, can extrapolate from oral traditions of recent cultures, can imagine based on universal human concerns, can speculate from the evidence of what survives in myth and legend and fairy tale. Perhaps the first stories were recounting of the day what game was seen, what dangers were encountered, what successes were achieved, what failures were experienced. The recounting itself would have been story arranging events in sequence, emphasizing certain moments, creating narrative arc that transformed random occurrence into meaningful experience. Perhaps the stories were origin tales, how the world began, how humans came to be, how death entered life, how fire was captured, how animals acquired their characteristics. Every culture has origin stories, creation myths that explain fundamental questions about existence, that provide framework for understanding the world, that ground identity in narrative about beginnings. The origin stories would have been the most important stories, the ones told repeatedly, the ones children had to learn, the ones that defined the group's understanding of itself and its place in cosmos. Perhaps the stories were cautionary tales, what happened to those who went alone into forest, who ignored warnings, who offended spirits, who broke taboos. The cautionary tales served practical function, taught safety rules, encoded survival knowledge, transmitted lessons learned through deadly experience, so others wouldn't have to learn same lessons through death. But cautionary tales served deeper function too, created moral framework, defined right and wrong behavior, established consequences for actions, made abstract principles concrete through narrative. Perhaps the stories were hero tales, the great hunter, the brave warrior, the clever trickster who solved impossible problems through wit or courage or luck. The hero tales satisfied psychological needs, provided models for behavior, offered hope that difficulties could be overcome, created larger-than-life figures who embodied groups' values and aspirations. The heroes were probably based on real people, exceptional hunters or warriors or leaders, whose achievements were remembered and embellished and transformed through retelling until they became legendary. The stories shaped consciousness, shaped how humans understood themselves and their world, created shared narratives that bound groups together. If everyone knew the same stories, everyone shared understanding of origins and values and proper behavior. Created identity. The stories defined who we were as distinct from who they were. Created boundaries between in-group and out-group. Created memory stories, preserved knowledge across generations, transmitted crucial information through mnemonic structures that made remembering easier. Language itself may have evolved partly to enable storytelling. The grammatical complexity that language requires serves practical communication, allows coordination of hunting and gathering, allows sharing of information about resources and dangers. But language's complexity serves storytelling better, allows past and future tenses, allows talking about things that happened or will happen rather than only about immediate present, allows conditional statements, allows discussing what might happen if certain conditions are met, allows subjunctive mood, allows exploring hypothetical situations, imagining alternatives, creating fictional scenarios that never occurred but that illuminate truth through invention. The once upon a time that signals entry into narrative space, the phrase, or its equivalent that appears in every language and culture, creates permission to suspend normal rules. Signals that what follows is not factual report, but is story, is narrative that operates according to different logic, is exploration of meaning rather than recounting of facts. The signal is necessary because stories mix truth and invention, contain real observations about human nature and social dynamics embedded in impossible events, contain wisdom disguised as entertainment, contain lessons that could not be taught directly but can be absorbed through identification with characters and investment in narrative. The stories were performed, were not just recited, but were enacted, voice rising and falling to match emotional content, hands gesturing to illustrate action, body moving to embody characters. The performance was crucial, made stories memorable, made them engaging, made them emotionally powerful in ways that flat recitation could never achieve. The storyteller was artist, mastered timing and emphasis and dramatic pause, knew when to speed up and when to slow down, knew how to build tension and how to release it, knew how to manipulate audiences' emotions to serve stories' purposes. The audience participated, was not passive, responded to storyteller through sounds and movements and facial expressions, influenced performance through their reactions, became part of storytelling event rather than mere recipients. The participation created feedback loop storyteller, adjusted based on audience response. Audience responded to storyteller's adjustments. The story emerged from collaboration between teller and listeners, rather than being fixed text transmitted unchanged. The stories changed with each telling. Were not memorized word for word, but were frameworks that allowed variation. Core plot remained stable, but details changed. Descriptions expanded or contracted. Emphasis shifted depending on audience and context, and storyteller's inspiration in the moment. The flexibility allowed stories to stay alive, allowed them to remain relevant as circumstances changed, allowed them to incorporate new knowledge or reflect new concerns, allowed each generation to make stories their own while maintaining continuity with tradition. The fire burns still in every campfire gathering where stories are told, in every recognition that narrative is fundamental to human experience, in every moment when we make sense of chaos by turning events into story with beginning, middle, end. The first stories are lost, left no trace except in the stories that followed, in the human need to speak and be heard, in the recognition that we are storytelling species, that narrative is how we understand experience, that facts without story are meaningless data, but facts woven into narrative become meaningful experience. The fire that gathered the first stories, the flames that created gathering place, the light that held darkness at bay while voices shaped sound into meaning. Forever burning, forever gathering, forever the center where humans sit and speak and listen and recognize themselves in stories that are simultaneously true and false, factual and fictional, ancient and eternal. The fire burns. The stories continue. And we are gathered still around literal or metaphorical fires, listening to stories that connect us to ancestors who sat around other fires and told other stories that were the same stories, that were always the same story of being human in a world that is beautiful and terrible and mysterious, and that requires story to make bearable. The fire, the stories, the gathering, forever. 2.5 million years ago, on the African savanna where grass stretched to every horizon and acacia trees cast small circles of shade beneath relentless sun, someone picked up a stone. Not just any stone, a stone with certain qualities, certain fracture properties, certain potential that only experience could recognize. Picked up another stone, and struck one against the other with specific angle, specific force, specific intention that transformed accident into innovation. The result was sharp flake, was piece of stone that had broken away from core, that had edge sharper than fingernail, stronger than tooth, capable of cutting through hide that hands could not tear. The flake was useful, could process game animal more efficiently, could cut plant fibers, could shape wood, could do what hands alone could not do. The flake was first tool that required manufacture rather than just selection, first technology that required understanding that materials could be shaped, that the shaping served purpose, that the shaped stone could be carried and used later rather than only in moment of immediate need. The recognition was not automatic. Required imagination, the ability to see in unworked stone the tool it could become, to envision the flake before it existed, to understand that striking stone in certain way would produce predictable result. Required planning the foresight to create tool before need arose rather than only when need was immediate. To invest time in tool making that could have been spent on direct food acquisition. Required intelligence, the understanding of three-dimensional geometry, of fracture mechanics, of which stones would flake properly, and which would shatter uselessly. The first tools were crude Alduin choppers named for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first recognized as tools rather than as natural rocks. The choppers required only few strikes to create select cobble of appropriate size and material. Strike against another stone or against ground to remove flakes, creating edge that is sharp enough to be useful. The simplicity suggests that first tool makers were learning, were experimenting, were discovering through trial and error which techniques worked and which didn't. But even crude tools were revolutionary, were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Were first technology in the sense of deliberately manufactured objects designed to extend human capability beyond biological limitations. Were first time that intelligence shaped materials according to plan, that imagined future affected present action, that tools were made not just found. Were threshold between using what nature provided and creating what nature didn't provide, between accepting limitations and transcending them. The tools became more complex. The Acheulean hand axes that appeared 1.7 million years ago showed dramatic advance, required dozens of strikes to achieve symmetrical teardrop shape, required understanding of how to thin the stone by removing flakes from both faces, required patience to create tool that was far more refined than function strictly required. The hand axes were beautiful, not accidentally beautiful, but intentionally so, shaped with aesthetic sense that went beyond pure utility, created with care that suggests pride in workmanship. The beauty raises questions. Why make tools more beautiful than necessary? Purely functional tool would cut as well as beautiful tool, would require less time and effort to create, would be more efficient use of resources. The excess suggests that even 1.7 million years ago, tool makers cared about more than function, cared about form, about elegance, about creating objects that were pleasing to make and to behold. Suggests that aesthetic sense is ancient, is not recent human development, but is fundamental to how we interact with world, is part of what makes us human. The Levallois technique appeared about 300,000 years ago, showed even greater sophistication. The technique involved preparing core by removing flakes from top surface, creating shape like tortoise shell, then striking core at precise angle to remove single large flake that was already shaped to be useful tool. The Levallois technique required understanding of three-dimensional geometry, required ability to envision how strikes would propagate through stone, required planning multiple steps ahead. The technique produced flakes that were more standardized, more predictable, more efficient use of raw material than earlier techniques. The tools required teaching. Children watching adults, learning through observation and practice, acquiring skills that took years to master. Stone knapping is not instinctive. Modern experimenters require extensive practice to create even crude tools, require years to master advanced techniques like Levallois. The teaching required patience, the adult allowing child to practice, even when practice meant wasted materials, even when child's efforts produced inferior tools that had to be discarded. The teaching required language or proto-language, some way of communicating, strike here, or angle the blow this way, or this stone will work better than that stone. The tools accumulated. Early humans didn't just make and use and discard, they made and kept, created tool kits that were carried from place to place, that were curated rather than treated as disposable. The accumulation required planning, required thinking about what might be needed in future, required carrying extra weight of tools that weren't immediately needed, but that might be needed later. The planning is what separates humans from other tool-using animals. Chimpanzees use tools but rarely make tools in advance, rarely carry tools long distances, rarely create specialized tools for specific purposes. The tools extended human capability exponentially, allowed processing of foods that would otherwise be inedible, tough plant materials, animal hides, bones that could be cracked to extract marrow, allowed hunting of animals that would otherwise be unobtainable spears and later bows, and eventually more complex weapons made humans effective predators despite lacking natural weapons like claws or large teeth, allowed construction of shelters cutting branches, shaping poles, creating structures that protected against weather, allowed creation of clothing scraping hides, cutting and sewing, making garments that allowed humans to survive in climates that naked bodies could not tolerate. The hand that extended through tool never stopped extending, extended from simple stone flake to hand axe to spear point to blade to arrowhead, extended to metals copper and bronze and iron, each requiring new technologies, each enabling new capabilities, extended to complex machines tools that made tools, tools that multiplied human power, tools that transformed what was possible, extended until humans could reshape continents, could alter climate, could reach beyond Earth itself into space that had seemed forever beyond reach. The first tool was stone, but the principle was everything, was recognition that humans were not limited to biological inheritance hands could grip, but hands plus tool could cut. Feet could walk, but feet plus wheel could travel farther and faster. Bodies could survive in certain climates, but bodies plus technology could survive anywhere. Was understanding that intelligence applied to materials could create new possibilities, that the gap between imagined tool and actual tool could be bridged through work, that the future could be different from the past because humans could make it different through deliberate creation. The tool that extended the hand, the flake that was sharper than fingernail, the stone that was shaped by intention and that shaped everything that followed, forever sharp, forever extending, forever testimony that being human means transcending biological limitations, means creating what nature didn't provide, means using intelligence to reshape world according to needs and desires and visions that exceed what is given. The tool remains in museums and archaeological sites, in the descendants of that first flake that have become the infinite complexity of modern technology. The hand extends still. The tool continues evolving. And we are the inheritors of that first recognition that stone could be shaped, that hand could be extended, that humans were not limited to what biology provided but could create capabilities that biology denied. The tool, forever extending, forever testimony, forever the beginning. In Indonesia, on the island of Flores, in a cave called Liang Bua where darkness accumulates like sediment and time, moves slowly through layers of earth and bone, Archaeologists found remains of humans who were not us. The bones were small, incredibly small, shockingly small for creatures who made tools and used fire and hunted and lived lives that were recognizably human. The adults stood barely 3 feet tall, smaller than modern children, smaller than any human species previously known, small enough to earn the nickname hobbits after Tolkien's fictional beings. Homo floresiensis. The species name was given to fossils that dated from perhaps 100,000 years ago to as recently as 50,000 years ago. The dating means they were contemporaries of modern humans, not distant ancestors, but parallel branch on human family tree. Different species evolving alongside us, existing simultaneously but separately, developing independently but recognizably human. The contemporaneity is unsettling, means that being human has not always meant being Homo sapiens, that humanity came in multiple forms, that the world once contained different kinds of humans living in different places with different bodies and different minds. The small size raises questions. Were they dwarfed by island isolation, the process called insular dwarfism, where species trapped on islands evolve smaller bodies because resources are limited and small body size requires less food? Were they descendants of Homo erectus who reached Flores 1 million years ago and evolved smaller over thousands of generations? Or were they descendants of even older human species, perhaps Homo habilis or Australopithecus, who left Africa earlier than anyone thought possible, and who somehow survived longer than anywhere else? The brain size raises more questions. The skulls show brain volumes around 400 cubic centimeters smaller than chimpanzee brains, smaller than any human brain, smaller than seemed possible for creatures who made tools as complex as the ones found in the cave. Yet they made tools, stone flakes and blades that required knowledge and skill to produce. They hunted. Bones of pygmy elephants found in the cave show cut marks from butchering, show that Homo floresiensis killed and processed large animals. They used fire, charcoal, and burned bones, suggest controlled use of flame for cooking and warmth and protection. How could small-brained humans do these things? The question challenges assumptions about relationship between brain size and intelligence, assumptions about what cognitive capabilities require, assumptions about what makes humans human. Perhaps intelligence is not simply function of brain size. Perhaps brain organization matters more than volume. Perhaps neural density or connectivity or chemical efficiency, allows small brain to accomplish what we assume requires large brain. Perhaps the tools and fire were learned rather than invented. Perhaps Homo floresiensis inherited these technologies from ancestors, or learned them from other human species they encountered, used them without understanding them in way that larger-brained humans understand. Or perhaps we simply don't understand intelligence, don't understand what it is or how it works, or what neural structures are necessary and what are optional. Perhaps our assumptions are wrong assumptions based on single data point of modern human intelligence, assumptions that may not generalize to other forms of consciousness, other ways of being intelligent, other solutions to problem of how to survive and thrive in world that demands both physical and mental capabilities. The faces of Homo floresiensis look at us from reconstructions, informed guesses based on skull structure, on comparative anatomy, on digital modeling that fills in missing pieces. The reconstructions show faces that are primitive, heavy brow ridges, protruding jaws, facial features that recall earlier human species more than modern humans. But the eyes are what disturb. Our human eyes. Our eyes that would have looked at world with consciousness, with intention, with emotions we would recognize. Our eyes that remind us that behind the strange face was a person, not person like us, but person nonetheless. Individual who thought and felt and lived life that mattered to them, even if it cannot matter to us except as curiosity, as reminder of paths not taken. The Neanderthals were closer relatives, shared ancestor with modern humans as recently as 500,000 years ago, evolved in Europe and Western Asia, while modern humans evolved in Africa, lived alongside modern humans for thousands of years, before disappearing around 40,000 years ago. The Neanderthals were sophisticated, made tools as complex as modern human tools, created art that included cave paintings and carved objects and jewelry, buried their dead with ceremony and grave goods, cared for injured and elderly who could not contribute to group survival. The Neanderthals interbred with modern humans. The genetic evidence is clear. Most modern humans carry small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, 1 to 4%, inherited from ancestors who mated with Neanderthals during period of contact and produced hybrid offspring who were fertile and who contributed to modern human gene pool. The interbreeding proves that Neanderthals and modern humans were similar enough biologically to produce viable offspring, proves that despite physical differences, they were same species in biological sense, proves that being human was category broad enough to include both groups. But the Neanderthals were not us. Were different in ways beyond physical appearance, different in how their brains were organized, different in their cognitive strengths and weaknesses, different in ways that might have affected how they thought and how they experienced world. The brain shape shows different proportions. Neanderthal brains were larger than modern human brains, but were organized differently, had more brain mass devoted to visual processing and body control, and less devoted to social cognition and abstract thinking. The difference might have been negligible, might have been profound. We cannot know what it was like to be Neanderthal, cannot access their consciousness, cannot understand whether their experience of being human was similar to ours or radically different. The Neanderthals died out. Whether modern humans killed them directly through warfare, or outcompeted them through superior technologies or social organization, or absorbed them through interbreeding until distinct Neanderthal population no longer existed, remains debated. Perhaps all three happened simultaneously. Some Neanderthals were killed, some were outcompeted, some were absorbed, and the combination was enough to eliminate them as distinct group. The elimination was slow, took thousands of years, happened gradually as modern humans expanded and Neanderthal populations contracted, ended around 40,000 years ago when last Neanderthals died in isolated refuges in southern Europe. The faces that were not quite human ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about what it means to be human when humanity comes in multiple forms. Questions about whether we would recognize other humans as human if we encountered them. Questions about what was lost when other human species died, what alternative ways of being human disappeared, what capacities and understandings and perspectives were extinguished. Questions about whether being sole surviving human species is triumph or tragedy, whether our survival and their extinction proves our superiority or simply proves our luck. The questions have no comfortable answers. The truth is that multiple human species coexisted for most of human evolutionary history, was normal rather than exceptional, was standard pattern rather than aberration. The abnormality is now the fact that only one human species survives, that humanity no longer comes in varieties, that we are alone in ways our ancestors never were. The loneliness might be price of success. Perhaps only one human species could survive long-term. Perhaps competition between human species was zero-sum, where one group's success required other groups' failure. Or loneliness might be accident, perhaps Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo floresiensis could have survived. Perhaps their extinction was contingent rather than necessary. Perhaps world could have contained multiple human species living peacefully or contentiously, but coexisting. We will never know. The other humans are gone extinct completely or absorbed so thoroughly into modern human gene pool that they survive only as small percentages of DNA scattered through modern populations. The faces look at us from reconstructions and from occasional complete skulls, and from imagination that tries to bridge gap between them and us. Look with eyes that were human eyes. Look from lives that were human lives, even though they were not our lives, even though they were not lived by people like us, even though they were extinguished before they could be recorded in any permanent form. The face that was not quite human, the relative that is extinct. The reminder that we are last the only human species remaining from lineage that once included many sole survivors of competition or luck or both, inheritors of world that once contained multiple kinds of humans and now contains only one. The loneliness of being sole survivors. The questions about what was lost. The recognition that being human has not always meant being Homo sapiens, that humanity once came in varieties, that the faces that were not quite human were human nonetheless. The faces look at us still from museum reconstructions, from fossil evidence, from the small percentages of Neanderthal DNA that most of us carry. Look asking to be remembered, asking to be recognized as human even though different, asking us to acknowledge that they existed and mattered, and that their extinction was loss not just for them but for us, for the variety that died, for the alternatives that were eliminated, for the richness of what humanity could have been if more than one version had survived. Language was not sudden invention, was not moment when first word was spoken, and everything changed. Was gradual emergence across hundreds of thousands or millions of years, sounds becoming symbols, symbols becoming structured, structure becoming grammar that could express infinite thoughts through finite rules. Was process so slow that no generation recognized it was happening, so gradual that the change was visible only across deep time, yet so profound that it transformed what it meant to be human? We do not know when language began. The question haunts linguists and anthropologists and paleoanthropologists who search for evidence in fossil skulls and ancient DNA and archaeological remains that might preserve traces of speech. Some argue language began 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, who migrated across continents and needed sophisticated communication for coordination, who had brain size approaching modern humans, and possibly had neural structures necessary for speech. Some argue 500,000 years ago, when brain size and throat structure reached configurations that made complex speech physically possible. Some argue 50,000 years ago, when symbolic behavior suddenly appears in archaeological record, cave art and jewelry, and elaborate burials, suggesting cognitive revolution that made abstract thought possible, and that language either caused or resulted from. The evidence is fragmentary and indirect. Language leaves no fossils. Words are sounds that disappear into air, cannot be preserved in stone or bone or ancient DNA. What remains are proxies, hyoid bones that show throat structure capable of complex speech, brain cases whose shape suggests regions devoted to language processing, tool kits whose complexity suggests communication systems sophisticated enough to transmit technical knowledge across generations. The proxies suggest that anatomical capability for speech evolved gradually, that physical structures necessary for modern human speech were in place perhaps 500,000 years ago, that whatever was limiting earlier humans from speaking as we speak was not anatomy, but was neural organization or social structure, or simply that gradual accumulation of complexity that language requires. The first word is lost, cannot be recovered, because words from 50,000 or 500,000 years ago left no recordings, because the beginning is beyond reach of any evidence that could survive. But we can imagine. Perhaps the first word was someone's name, the naming that creates identity, that distinguishes one person from another, that allows reference to individuals who are not present. Names are fundamental, appear in all languages, serve as foundation for more complex communication, create the you and me and them, that structure social interaction. Perhaps the first word was warning, danger, predator, fire, the urgent communication that could save lives, that made immediate survival more likely. The utility argues for warning as early language function. Natural selection would favor groups whose communication systems allowed rapid sharing of critical information, would favor individuals who could alert others to threats. The warnings would start simple, single sounds associated with specific dangers, and would elaborate gradually as the system became more sophisticated. Perhaps the first word was question: why, how, what, the curiosity that made humans different from other animals, that drove exploration and innovation and the accumulation of knowledge. Questions require language more complex than simple warnings require understanding of absence, of what is not known, of gaps that need filling. Questions might have emerged only after language reached certain threshold of complexity, only after humans understood that knowledge could be incomplete, only after consciousness became reflexive enough to wonder about its own limitations. The word named the world, made distinctions that perception alone could not make, separated this food from this poison. The distinction is crucial, but is not obvious from appearance alone, requires knowledge transmitted through language or through dangerous trial and error. Separated friend from stranger, the distinction shapes behavior, determines whether to approach or flee or fight, requires categorical thinking that language enables and reinforces. Separated sacred from profane, the distinction has no physical basis, exists only in human minds, becomes real only through shared agreement that certain places or objects or actions have special status. Language created time. Before language, awareness was probably limited to present moment with some capacity for immediate past and immediate future. But language allows discussion of distant past and distant future, allows yesterday and tomorrow and many seasons ago, and when ice comes, allows planning across scales that exceed individual lifespan, allows transmission of knowledge about events that current generation did not witness, but that previous generations recorded in oral tradition, allows history, the preservation of past through narrative that connects present to origins, that creates continuity across generations, that makes humans aware of themselves as part of larger temporal structure. Language created abstraction. Before language, thinking was probably limited to concrete things: this stone, that animal, my hunger. But language allows discussion of justice and beauty and truth, concepts that have no physical form, but that shape human behavior as powerfully as physical needs. Allows moral reasoning, discussion of right and wrong, of what should be versus what is, of ideals that never exist in pure form, but that provide standards against which reality is judged. Allows science, the abstract principles that govern natural phenomena, the mathematical relationships that describe physical laws, the theoretical constructs that predict observations not yet made. Language created shared reality. Without language, each individual experiences world through private perception. What I see and hear and feel is mine alone, cannot be directly shared with others. Language creates intersubjectivity, allows me to describe my experience, and allows you to understand the description, and allows us both to confirm that we are experiencing same external reality. The confirmation is never perfect. Language is ambiguous. Understanding is incomplete. Private experience can never be fully communicated. But language creates enough sharing that humans can coordinate understanding, can build on others' knowledge, can accumulate culture that transcends individual minds. The accumulation is what makes humans unique. Other animals have communication systems, bird songs and whale calls, and bee dances and primate vocalizations. But no other system has language's productivity, the ability to create infinite novel statements from finite elements. No other system has language's displacement, the ability to discuss things distant in space and time. No other system has language's reflexivity, the ability to use language to discuss language itself. These properties make human communication fundamentally different in kind rather than merely in degree, make possible the cultural accumulation that defines human civilization. Language varies enormously across cultures. Currently, about 7,000 languages spoken globally, each with different sounds and grammatical structures and vocabularies. The variation demonstrates that language is cultural rather than biological, while capacity for language is innate. Particular languages must be learned, are transmitted through culture rather than through genes. The variation also demonstrates that all languages are equally complex and capable. There are no primitive languages, no languages that cannot express modern concepts, no languages that are inherently limited. Any human raised in any linguistic environment will acquire whatever language they are exposed to with equal facility. Yet beneath the variation is unity. All languages have nouns and verbs. All have ways of forming questions and negations. All have ways of referring to past and future. All have similar developmental trajectories. Children acquire language in similar stages regardless of which language they're learning. All appear to be governed by universal grammar, underlying principles that constrain possible languages, that make some grammatical structures possible and others impossible. The universals suggest that language capacity is biologically determined, that human brains are structured specifically for language, that evolution shaped neural architecture to make language possible. The word flows still in every conversation and every book and every thought that moves through linguistic structures. Flows from the first word we cannot recover through all the words that have been spoken since. flows carrying meaning and creating meaning, and transforming meaning endlessly. Language is not just tool for communication, is the structure through which humans think, is the medium through which consciousness operates, is what makes human minds rather than animal minds. The word that named the world named also the namer, created humans as subjects who could reflect on their own existence, who could wonder about their origins and their purposes and their futures. The word that named the world, the sound that became symbol, the communication that transcended immediate circumstance and created culture and history and abstract thought, forever spoken, forever evolving, forever testimony that being human means living in world made of words, world where language shapes perception, where naming creates categories, where the capacity to speak about what is absent makes possible everything that separates humans from other animals. The word continues. The naming continues. And we are the inheritors of that first word, whatever it was, whenever it was spoken, by whoever spoke it. We inherit the capacity for language and the linguistic worlds that language creates. The word, forever naming, forever creating, forever the beginning of everything that makes us human. There was no moment, no single birth when ape became human, no sudden transformation when one generation was one thing and the next generation was another. The threshold was not doorway, but was gradient, was slope so gradual that climbing it felt like standing still, was change so slow that no individual ever recognized that change was happening. Yet looking across the vast distances of deep time, the transformation was total, was undeniable, was journey from ape to human that took millions of years, and that can never be reduced to single decisive moment. Walking upright came first perhaps 4 million years ago, perhaps earlier. The shift from knuckle walking to bipedalism that freed hands for carrying and for tool use, but that came with costs. Difficult childbirth because upright posture narrowed the birth canal, made human birth dangerous in ways that birth is not dangerous for other primates. Vulnerable backs because spine that evolved for horizontal loading was stressed when loaded vertically, made humans prone to back pain and disc problems that other apes avoid. Slower running because 2 legs are slower than 4, made humans vulnerable to predators that could outrun them, required compensating through intelligence and cooperation and weapons. Yet the costs were worth paying. The freed hands could carry food back to home base rather than eating where food was found, could transport infants who could no longer cling to mother's fur, could eventually make and carry tools that extended human capability beyond biological inheritance. The upright posture, reduced sun exposure upright body, presents less surface area to overhead sun than horizontal body, reduces heat stress in tropical environment where early humans evolved. The height allowed seeing over tall grass in savanna, allowed spotting predators and prey from greater distance, provided surveillance advantage that four-legged ancestors lacked. Brain expansion came later, perhaps 2 million years ago. The rapid increase in cranial capacity that made humans intelligent in ways that earlier hominids were not. The expansion required enormous caloric input. Brains are expensive organs, consume 20% of body's energy despite being only 2% of body weight. The energy demands meant that brain expansion was possible only with improved diet, high-energy foods like meat and cooked plants that provided calories that earlier plant-based diets could not provide. The improved diet created feedback loop. Larger brains enabled better hunting and food processing, which enabled even larger brains, which enabled even better hunting in cycle that accelerated brain growth. But larger brains brought costs. The childbirth became even more difficult. Human infants are born remarkably underdeveloped compared to other primates, are helpless for years rather than months, require intensive parental care that limits mothers' ability to gather food, and that requires father and extended family to provide support. The long childhood is necessary because large brain requires long learning period. Humans must learn culture and language, and all the knowledge that our species has accumulated must be taught rather than relying primarily on instinct, must spend years developing neural structures that will eventually make adult cognition possible. Language came later, still perhaps 500,000 years ago, perhaps much more recently. The emergence of symbolic thought that allowed abstraction and metaphor, and the transmission of complex cultural information. Language transformed what brains could do, enabled humans to think about things not present, to plan across long time scales, to coordinate complex activities, to accumulate knowledge across generations. Language might have been the crucial threshold, the change that made humans fundamentally different from earlier hominids, that created the symbolic consciousness that characterizes modern human minds. But when did it happen? When did ape become human? The question assumes there was moment, was clear boundary, was point where one could say, before this was ape, after this is human. The assumption is wrong. The boundary does not exist not in nature, only in definitions we impose on continuous variation. Lucy was not human, was Australopithecine, was more ape than human in brain size and culture and cognition. But Lucy walked upright, was on the path toward humanity, was ancestor who carried in her body the changes that would eventually, given enough time and enough generations, lead to us. Homo habilis, handy man, was first to make stone tools but was not quite human. Had brain larger than Lucy's but smaller than ours. Had hands capable of precision grip needed for tool making, but had feet that retained some climbing adaptation. Was threshold creature between ape and human, sharing characteristics of both, fitting clearly into neither category, except that we force classification on beings that existed in continuum, rather than in discrete categories. Homo erectus was closer walked as we walk, made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, migrated out of Africa and colonized much of the Old World, but lacked modern human brain size, lacked evidence of symbolic culture, lacked language as we know language, or at least left no evidence of language in archaeological record. Was human in body, but perhaps not yet human in mind, or perhaps was human in different way, had different kind of consciousness, thought differently than we think in ways we cannot access or understand. Homo heidelbergensis, common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans, had brain size approaching ours, made complex tools, hunted large game cooperatively, but left no art, no jewelry, no clear evidence of symbolic thought that defines modern human cognition. Was at threshold, possessed capabilities that would, in descendant species, become modern human cognition, but perhaps had not yet crossed into symbolic consciousness. Perhaps experienced world in way that was almost human but not quite. Neanderthals were human enough to breed with us. The hybrid offspring were fertile, contributed to modern human gene pool, proved that biological boundary between Neanderthal and modern human was permeable or non-existent. But Neanderthals were not us, differed in brain organization, in cognitive profile, possibly in language capability, certainly in cultural complexity. Were parallel solution to question of what human could mean different answer that coexisted with our answer for thousands of years before disappearing. Where is the threshold? If we trace lineage backward from modern humans through Neanderthal common ancestor, through Homo heidelbergensis, through Homo erectus, through Homo habilis, through Australopithecines, where do we stop being human? Lucy walked upright, but that is not enough. Birds walk upright. Homo habilis made tools, but that is not enough. Chimpanzees make simple tools. Homo erectus controlled fire, but that is not enough. Fire control alone does not make human consciousness. Homo heidelbergensis had large brain, but that is not enough. Brain size without symbolic culture is not humanity as we understand it. The truth is that the threshold is not place, but is process, is not moment, but is movement that continues still. The becoming never ended, did not stop when anatomically modern humans appeared 300,000 years ago, did not stop when behavioral modernity appeared 50,000 years ago, has not stopped now. We are not finished product, but our work in progress. Evolution continues operating on us as it operated on our ancestors. Culture continues shaping us in ways that biology alone cannot account for. We continue changing in ways we do not recognize because the change is so gradual. Because no generation experiences itself as different from previous generation, even though across deep time the transformation is total. The threshold where ape became human is not behind us in distant past, is beneath our feet in present moment, is ahead of us in future we cannot imagine. We stand on threshold still between what we were and what we are becoming, between ape past and post-human future, between biological evolution that shaped us for millions of years and cultural and technological evolution that now shapes us faster than biology ever could. The threshold has no ending because becoming has no ending, because humans are not stable category, but our process, our movement, our continuous transformation. Our ancestors 4 million years ago were apes who walked upright. Our ancestors 2 million years ago were apes who made tools. Our ancestors 500,000 years ago were almost humans who had large brains, but perhaps not yet symbolic consciousness. Our ancestors 50,000 years ago were anatomically and behaviorally modern humans who were like us in every way that matters. But were they us? Were they human in the way we are human? Did they experience consciousness as we experience it? Did they think as we think, feel as we feel, understand themselves as we understand ourselves? We cannot know, cannot access their consciousness, cannot experience world as they experienced it, cannot do more than project our own consciousness backward and assume theirs was similar. Perhaps it was. Perhaps consciousness is universal, is same in all humans regardless of when or where they lived. Or perhaps consciousness changes, perhaps the invention of writing changed how humans think. Perhaps literacy restructures neural organization. Perhaps modern consciousness, with its constant information overload, and its global interconnection is fundamentally different from consciousness of isolated preliterate groups who lived closer to nature and farther from technology. The threshold where ape became human, the boundary that does not exist, the moment that never happened because it happened gradually across millions of years, the process that continues because being human is not destination but is journey, forever becoming, forever threshold, forever the question of where ape ends and human begins, where animal consciousness gives way to human consciousness, where biological evolution gives way to cultural evolution, where we stop being what we were and start being what we will become. The threshold, forever beneath us, forever ahead of us, forever the process of becoming that defines being human. We do not know when humans first laughed. Laughter leaves no archaeological trace, no bones that can be measured, no stones that can be dated, no cave paintings that capture the sound or the feeling or the moment when amusement became expression, when joy found voice in sound that was uniquely human. The silence in the record is absolute, yet laughter existed, must have existed. Because laughter is universal, appears in all human cultures, appears in human infants before language develops, appears to be wired into neural structures that evolved specifically to enable this particular expression of this particular emotion. Laughter is ancient, predates humanity, appears in our closest primate relatives, proves that capacity for laughter is inheritance from ancestors who were not yet human. Chimpanzees laugh, make panting sounds during play that acoustically resemble human laughter, that serve similar social functions, that express similar emotional states. Bonobos laugh, gorillas laugh, orangutans laugh. The laughter is different from ours, is more like panting, lacks the melodic quality of human laughter, cannot be voluntarily controlled in ways that human laughter can be controlled. But the similarity is unmistakable. The evolutionary continuity is clear. Yet human laughter is different, is more than primate panting, became something more complex when it became human, became communication more subtle than words, became expression that carries meanings language cannot capture, became social tool more powerful than simple expression of amusement. The laughter that signals safety, the laughter among friends that says, "We are relaxed together. No threat exists. We can let guards down." The laughter that creates bonds, shared amusement that connects people more deeply than shared silence, that creates intimacy through synchronized response to humor. The laughter that diffuses tension, the nervous laughter that transforms awkwardness into something bearable, that makes uncomfortable situations manageable through acknowledgement that they are awkward. The laughter that includes and excludes. The in-group laughter that strengthens solidarity while implicitly defining who is not part of the group. The laughter at someone versus laughter with someone, the distinction is crucial. Shapes whether laughter builds relationship or damages it. Determines whether humor is gift or weapon. The laughter that ridicules, that mocks and belittles and establishes hierarchy through shared amusement at someone's expense. The laughter that challenges, that uses humor to subvert authority, to question assumptions, to make visible the absurdities that power wants hidden. When did laughter become this complex? When did it evolve from simple primate panting during play into the sophisticated social tool that human laughter represents? The question has no answer because the evolution was gradual, because each generation's laughter was slightly more complex than previous generations, because the accumulation happened so slowly that no one ever noticed the change, even though across deep time the transformation was total. Perhaps language made the difference. Perhaps once humans could speak, once they could create narratives and describe situations and play with multiple meanings, laughter could attach to more complex cognitive processes, could respond not just to physical play, but to verbal wit, could express amusement at incongruity, at the gap between expectation and reality, at the juxtaposition of unlike things, at the reversal of normal categories. Could enable jokes, narratives structured specifically to create surprise, to violate expectations in safe ways, to produce the cognitive pleasure that comes from resolution of setup through punchline. The first human laughter, real laughter, not just primate panting, but human humor, perhaps came when someone made connection between unlike things and recognized the incongruity as funny. Perhaps when someone's dignity was undermined in non-threatening way and group responded with laughter that said, "We see your vulnerability, but we still accept you. Your loss of dignity does not threaten your status among us." Perhaps when language became sophisticated enough to enable wordplay, to create ambiguity, to allow double meanings that are humor's foundation. Or perhaps laughter was always complex. Perhaps even before language, even before anatomically modern humans, our ancestors found humor in situations that we would find funny: the person who trips but doesn't hurt themselves, the unexpected sound that startles but doesn't threaten, the successful completion of difficult task that brings relief expressed through laughter. Perhaps humor is older than language, is primate inheritance that became more elaborate in humans, but that was never simply added to human repertoire, but was always present in modified forms. The functions of laughter are multiple. Laughter is play, is signal that interaction is non-serious, is permission to engage in mock aggression or mock danger without fear of real consequences. Laughter is bonding, creates emotional synchrony, coordinates group members' emotional states, strengthens relationships through shared positive experiences. Laughter is learning, allows exploration of boundaries in safe ways, allows practice of social skills, allows experimentation with taboo topics through humor that makes the taboo discussable. Laughter is coping, transforms stress and fear, and anger into something bearable through humor that reframes situations, that finds absurdity in difficulty, that refuses to be overwhelmed by circumstances that seem overwhelming. The gallows humor of soldiers and doctors, and anyone who faces death regularly humor that seems inappropriate to outsiders, but that serves crucial function of maintaining sanity, of creating psychological distance from horrors that close psychological distance would make unbearable. Laughter is communication, conveys information about emotional state, about social relationships, about cognitive processing that words cannot easily describe. The different types of laughter: genuine, spontaneous laughter versus polite social laughter versus nervous, anxious laughter versus mocking, derisive laughter. Each conveys different meaning. Each serves different function. Each is recognizable by acoustic properties that listeners decode automatically without conscious awareness. Laughter is universal, but humor is cultural. What makes one culture laugh might not amuse another. What was funny in past might not be funny now. Humor requires shared context, shared knowledge, shared values, shared experiences that make joke land or make it fail. Yet beneath cultural variation are universal patterns. Humans everywhere laugh at incongruity, at surprise, at relief from tension, at transgression of norms in safe contexts. The universals suggest deep roots, suggest that humor is not arbitrary cultural construction, but is expression of cognitive and emotional structures that all humans share. The first laughter echoes still in every joke told around dinner tables or campfires, in every comedy performance, in every moment when humans connect through shared amusement. Echoes from beginning we cannot date, from moment we cannot recover, from the first time someone laughed and someone else understood and laughed too, and the sound bound them together in recognition that being human meant finding joy in absurdity, finding connection in shared amusement, finding relief in laughter that acknowledges difficulty while refusing to surrender to it. The laughter of children, spontaneous and frequent and expressing pure joy without self-consciousness perhaps, resembles the first human laughter more closely than adult laughter does. Children laugh at simple incongruities, at peekaboo games where face disappears and reappears, at funny sounds and unexpected movements, at the pure pleasure of play, without concern for social appropriateness or comedic sophistication. The child's laughter is unguarded, is honest, is expression of delight that has not yet been complicated by social norms and cultural expectations. As we age, laughter becomes more controlled, more about social bonding than pure amusement, more performative than spontaneous, more tool than expression. We learn to laugh at jokes we don't find funny because laughing is expected. Learn to suppress laughter when amusement is inappropriate. Learn to use laughter strategically to ingratiate ourselves, to deflect criticism, to mask discomfort. The sophistication is necessary for social navigation, but perhaps something is lost: the pure joy of child's spontaneous laughter, the honest expression before social training teaches us to control and modify and perform rather than simply express. Yet even adult laughter retains traces of that original spontaneity. The laughter that overtakes us despite attempts to suppress it, the inappropriate laughter during serious moments, the laughter that starts as small chuckle and builds until it's uncontrollable, the shared laughter among friends that feeds on itself, until everyone is laughing not at original joke, but at the act of laughing together. These moments of unguarded laughter connect us to ancestors whose laughter was less controlled, less performed, more purely expressive of joy and connection, and the pleasure of being alive in a world that, despite its difficulties, sometimes presents us with things worth laughing about. The echo of the first laughter, the sound that made us human, the joy that survived through all hardships and all sorrows and all the difficulties that being human entails, forever echoing, forever binding people together through shared amusement, forever testimony that humans need more than food and shelter and safety, need joy, need humor, need laughter that transforms difficulty into something bearable, and that creates moments of connection and pleasure even in a world that often seems designed to deny both. The laughter continues. The echo persists. And we are the inheritors of that first laugh, whatever prompted it, whoever laughed first. Whenever it happened, we inherit the capacity for laughter and the recognition that humor matters, that joy matters, that finding things to laugh about is as essential to being human as finding things to eat. The echo, forever sounding, forever testimony, forever the laughter that says, I am human, you are human, we are together in this strange world, and sometimes the only appropriate response is to laugh. Conclusion, and so we arrive at the end of our journey, though endings, like beginnings, are arbitrary markings we impose on processes that know no natural boundaries, that flow continuously without pause or punctuation, except where we choose to place them. We have walked backward through time, have stood with ancestors whose names we will never know, whose faces we can only imagine, whose consciousness we can only glimpse through the evidence they left behind: footprints in volcanic ash, paintings in dark caves, tools scattered across continents, graves adorned with care that speaks across millennia. We began in darkness before memory, and we end in darkness before sleep, the two darknesses connected, perhaps, in ways we do not fully understand. The darkness of deep time and the darkness of unconsciousness both hold mysteries that resist full illumination. Both contain origins that we seek but cannot completely recover. Both represent thresholds where human understanding reaches its limits and must rely on inference, on imagination, on the careful work of filling gaps in evidence with educated speculation. The story we have traveled through was not simple story of progress, was not linear march from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from barely human to fully human. Was instead complex movement forward and backward simultaneously, achieving new capabilities while losing old ones, gaining sophistication while perhaps losing spontaneity, becoming more powerful while becoming more vulnerable in different ways. The first humans who walked upright gained free hands but suffered difficult childbirth. The first humans who made tools extended their reach but became dependent on technology in ways that earlier hominids were not. The first humans who spoke gained language but perhaps lost other forms of perception and connection that language cannot capture. What have we learned? Perhaps only that being human is process, not state. That humanity did not arrive suddenly, but emerged gradually across millions of years of becoming. That the threshold between ape and human is not sharp boundary, but is gradient so gradual that climbing it felt like standing still. That our ancestors were like us, but also not like us, had bodies increasingly similar to ours, but had minds that perhaps worked differently, experienced consciousness in ways we cannot access or replicate or fully understand. We learned that first expressions of humanity were surprisingly sophisticated, that art 40,000 years old rivals modern art in skill and beauty, that music existed as soon as evidence can detect it, that burial of dead with elaborate ceremony shows care and belief in afterlife, or at least in importance of marking death's transition. We learned that other human species coexisted with our ancestors, that humanity once came in multiple forms, that Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo floresiensis were human in their own ways even though they were not us, that their extinction was loss not just for them, but for the variety of what human could mean. We learned that migration is fundamental to human nature, that our ancestors walked out of Africa 50,000 years ago and never stopped moving, that curiosity and restlessness and drive to see what lies beyond horizon are inheritances we carry still, that being human means being uncomfortable with staying in one place, means always wondering what lies beyond, means continuing the journey that began with first footprints, and that continues in every journey we take. But perhaps what we learned most deeply is how little we know, how fragmentary the evidence is, how much has been lost, how much we must infer from tiny traces that survived only through accident of preservation, only through geological chance, only through processes that saved some things while allowing most things to disappear without trace. The silence in the record is vast. The voices of ancestors are mostly silent. The thoughts and feelings and daily experiences of people who lived and died across millions of years are gone, left no record except in the bones and stones and rare preservations that archaeology recovers and interprets. The evening has deepened now into night. The journey through time has brought us full circle from darkness of deep time to darkness of sleep that approaches. The history we have traveled was never simply about past, was always about present too, about understanding where we came from in order to understand what we are, about recognizing that we are not finished products, but are continuations of processes that began millions of years ago, and that continue still, about seeing ourselves as part of lineage that stretches backward to origins we can barely glimpse and forward to futures we cannot imagine. Rest now. Let the journey settle into sleep's embrace. Let the weight of deep time become something lighter, not burden but connection, not distance but intimacy, not separation but recognition that we are linked to every human who came before through unbroken chain of ancestors, through inheritance of bodies and minds that evolved across millions of years specifically to make us possible. The footprints walk through time. The cave paintings endure in darkness. The bone flutes are silent but speak of music that once was. The graves remember the dead. The migrations continue. The hands reach across millennia. The fires gather us still. The tools extend our reach. The faces that were not quite human look at us from reconstructions and from the Neanderthal DNA that many of us carry. The words name the world. The threshold remains beneath us. The laughter echoes. And we are the inheritors, are the children of all these ancestors, are the latest chapter in story that began millions of years ago with apes who learned to walk upright, are not ending but are continuation, are not destination but are passage between what was and what will be, are standing on threshold always between past we barely understand and future we cannot predict, between animal origins and uncertain destiny, between the ape we were and whatever we are becoming. Sleep now. Dream of ancestors who walked before you. Dream of the long journey from ape to human. Dream of the becoming that has no ending because we are always becoming, are always threshold, are always standing between what we were and what we will be. The journey continues in your dreams. The story has no ending because you are part of it. You are the latest sentence in narrative that began millions of years ago and that continues through you and through all humans who live now and who will live in futures we cannot imagine. The footprints walk. The paintings endure. The music plays in silence. The graves remember. The hands reach, the fires burn, the tools extend, the faces watch, the words flow, the threshold waits, the laughter echoes, and you carry it all forward. Carry the inheritance of millions of years of evolution. Carry the DNA of ancestors who survived impossible odds. Carry the culture and language and knowledge and humor and consciousness that define being human. Carry the journey forward into whatever comes next. Rest now. The journey is complete for tonight. But the larger journey, the journey of becoming human, that journey never ends. You are part of it. Forever connected to ancestors you will never know but whose lives made your life possible. Forever standing on threshold where ape became human and where human continues becoming whatever humans will become. Sleep well, dream deep. And when you wake, remember that you are human, the latest expression of process that began in Africa millions of years ago. The inheritor of all the ancestors who walked and painted and made music, and buried their dead, and migrated across the world and spoke the first words and laughed the first laughter. You are human. And being human means carrying forward what was given, means continuing the journey, means standing on threshold always between past and future, between what we were and what we will become. The evening ends. The darkness deepens. The sleep approaches. And in that darkness, the ancestors walk, still leaving footprints that time cannot erase, creating art that darkness preserves, playing music that silence remembers, speaking words that echo through millennia, laughing with joy that suffering cannot extinguish. You are their descendant, their inheritor, their continuation. Sleep now. The journey of tonight is complete, but the journey of humanity, that journey continues forever.